Welcome to a new video from the Color Vistas brand. If you've ever worked with shrink wrap during sublimation printing, you might have run into issues like the wrap melting or damaging your project. In today's video, I'll explain why your shrink wrap is melting during sublimation and how you can prevent it from happening. Stick around for tips and tricks that'll save you time, materials, and frustration. Let's get started. Why use shrink wrap for sublimation? First, let's quickly cover why shrink wrap is used in sublimation printing. Shrink wrap is essential when working with irregularly shaped items like tumblers, mugs, and other 3D objects. It ensures that your sublimation paper stays firmly in place during the heat transfer process, resulting in even, high-quality prints. The shrink wrap applies uniform pressure across the surface, which helps the ink transfer evenly. However, if your shrink wrap is melting or getting too hot, it can ruin the entire project. Let's dive into why that happens and what you can do to fix it. So, why is my shrink wrap melting? The most common reason shrink wrap melts during sublimation is due to incorrect heat settings. Since sublimation printing requires high heat to transfer the design, it's easy to exceed the temperature limits of the shrink wrap if you're not careful. Here are some key factors that might cause shrink wrap to melt. Temperature too high. The primary cause of melting shrink wrap is using a heat press or oven set to too high a temperature. Shrink wrap can start to melt and degrade at temperatures above its tolerance level, which can vary depending on the brand and type. Incorrect press time. Pressing or baking your item for too long can also cause the shrink wrap to overheat and melt. Low-quality shrink wrap. Not all shrink wrap is made equal. Some lower-quality wraps aren't designed to handle the high heat required for sublimation and will melt more easily. Uneven heating. If your oven or heat press doesn't distribute heat evenly, certain areas of the shrink wrap can become overheated while other areas remain unaffected. This uneven heat distribution can result in melting or burn marks. Let's take a look at some tips for your projects. Tip 1. Choose high-quality shrink wrap. One of the easiest ways to prevent melting is to invest in high-quality shrink wrap specifically designed for sublimation. Not all shrink wraps are heat-resistant enough to withstand sublimation temperatures, so using the right type can make a big difference. Look for sublimation-specific wraps. Check the packaging to ensure the shrink wrap is rated for high heat and is intended for sublimation use. This type of wrap is generally designed to tolerate higher temperatures without melting. Read reviews and recommendations. If you're unsure which shrink wrap to buy, check reviews or recommendations from other sublimation crafters to see what works best for them. Tip 2. Use the correct temperature and time settings. Your temperature and time settings are crucial for preventing shrink wrap from melting. Here's how to dial in the right settings. Follow manufacturer guidelines. Always follow the recommended temperature settings for the sublimation wrap and item you're working with. Typically, sublimation projects require a temperature of around 350 degrees to 400 degrees, but this may vary based on the substrate and shrink wrap type. Don't exceed temperature limits. If the shrink wrap you're using has a maximum heat tolerance, never exceed that temperature. Most high-quality shrink wraps can handle up to 400 degrees, but check the packaging to be sure. Adjust pressing time. Shorten the press or baking time if you notice the shrink wrap starting to melt. For example, if your current time is 10 minutes, reduce it by 1 to 2 minutes to see if that helps without affecting the ink transfer. Tip 3. Check your heat source. If your shrink wrap is melting even at the recommended temperature, your heat press or oven might be the issue. Uneven or inaccurate heating can cause localized melting on certain areas of the shrink wrap. Calibrate your heat press. Make sure your heat press is properly calibrated to distribute heat evenly. Some presses develop cold or hot spots over time, so it's essential to check for inconsistencies across the platen. Use a convection oven for even heat. If you're using a regular oven to bake your sublimation items, consider switching to a convection oven, which distributes heat more evenly. This reduces the risk of overheating any part of the shrink wrap. Tip 4. Ensure proper shrink wrap application. The way you apply the shrink wrap can also impact how well it holds up during sublimation. Apply shrink wrap tightly. Make sure the shrink wrap is tightly and evenly applied around your item. Loose or uneven application can cause areas of the wrap to wrinkle, leading to uneven heat distribution and potential melting. Use a heat gun to shrink. Evenly. Before placing the item in the oven or heat press, use a heat gun to shrink the wrap evenly. This helps ensure there are no air bubbles or loose areas that could lead to uneven heat exposure. Tip 5. Use heat-resistant tape. For added security, use heat-resistant tape to hold your sublimation paper and shrink wrap firmly in place. This ensures that the wrap doesn't shift during the heating process, which can cause uneven heating or melting. Tape around the edges. Secure the edges of your sublimation paper to the substrate using heat-resistant tape before applying the shrink wrap. This prevents the paper from moving and creating wrinkles under the wrap. Use minimal tape. While heat-resistant tape is helpful, don't overdo it. Too much tape can interfere with the sublimation process or cause slight marks where the tape was applied. Tip 6. Test with small items. If you're worried about shrink wrap melting on a larger project, test your settings with a small item first. This way you can adjust the temperature, time, and technique before working on a more expensive or important project. Start with scrap materials. Use leftover or scrap sublimation blanks to test your heat settings. This allows you to fine-tune your approach without wasting high-quality items. Gradually adjust. Make small adjustments to your temperature and time settings based on your test results. This will help you find the sweet spot for your specific shrink wrap and item. Now, let's move on to some common mistakes to avoid. Here are a few common mistakes that lead to shrink wrap melting during sublimation. Using non-sublimation. Shrink wrap. Be sure to use shrink wrap specifically designed for sublimation projects. Regular shrink wrap isn't made to withstand the high temperatures needed for sublimation. Ignoring temperature guidelines. Don't exceed the recommended temperature for your shrink wrap or substrate. Even if your sublimation ink requires high heat, balance it with what the shrink wrap can handle. Not pre-testing. Always test your setup with a small item before committing to a full-size project. This will help you catch any issues with heat settings, wrap application, or equipment. Great. Now it's time for final thoughts. Shrink wrap is an incredibly useful tool in sublimation printing, but if it's melting during your projects, it can cause a lot of frustration. By using high-quality shrink wrap, adjusting your heat and time settings, and applying the wrap evenly, you can prevent this problem and create beautiful, flawless sublimation prints. I hope you enjoyed the video. Check out the links in the description for recommended sublimation products where applicable, and don't forget to visit my website for more guides and resources on sublimation. See the link in the description below. Please consider liking my video and subscribing to my channel. See you in the next video.